three things when you're starting your storyboard that I want you to always keep in mind. And those are going to be finding the storytelling pose, grouping people who talk together, and then figuring out if you can use a dynamic shot. So storytelling poses, grouping people who talk, and finding dynamic shots. We're going to go through those one at a time here. What do I mean by storytelling pose? With every sequence that you get in a script, there will be a point to that sequence that the writer is trying to convey. Sometimes it's the fact that a character does something, picks something up and leaves, steals something. Sometimes it's just a matter of a character's having an argument or interacting with each other, but there's generally going to be one specific point of a sequence, and that becomes your storytelling pose. If you were to able to string together just the storytelling poses of several sequences, you would get a general sense of how the script is unfolding. So for instance, in this sequence, the cops have all banded together to confront and argue with Kevin. And so the storytelling, the point of this sequence is that they are grouped together against him. And so making sure, generally speaking, when I story sequence, the first thing I will find is that storytelling pose and make sure that I arrange all of the characters on one side of the screen, leave a gap in this instance, and have this character isolated and alone. So we can tell immediately, even if we didn't know what was happening in the words of the script, we will know that one set of characters is ganging up in opposition to this single character. This becomes the storytelling pose. Now, cutting in to close or group shots, depending who's talking, will all stem out of this main storytelling pose. So first thing you want to do is go through and find your storytelling poses for your sequences, and then everything will break up from there. In this example, for instance, Chief is talking to Kevin, but Fitz in the background overhears them give an important piece of information. So knowing that in the script it was written that Fitz here in the background overhears what they're talking about, you can devise a setup in which we as the audience are close to these characters hearing them, and we still get to see reaction to overhearing them. So that becomes the storytelling pose for this shot. Here's yet another one where the police got a robot cop, and this character over here found a switch that switched him from good cop to bad cop, and he's delighted that switching the robot to bad cop, he is now taking on doing this horrible thing to the chief. So again, to summarize everything that's happening in the script, we find a single pose that shows the robot, who is now a bad cop, doing this to the chief, and that this character is delighted in seeing it. This becomes the storytelling pose. It's the point of the entire sequence that was written. And so once you find that storytelling pose, you can start plotting out where your cutaways be, when you're going to show different characters based on the script, but you know that this is sort of the focal point that you will be working around to tell the point of this sequence correctly. Grouping characters who must talk together. Because Primetime is so much about what the characters are saying to each other, it becomes very important to do medium shots and close-ups of those characters talking so they can deliver jokes and points to each other. And so it's more important, I mean, there are moments when you'll have to do action, but the primary purpose of primetime sitcoms is what the characters are saying to each other. So grouping those characters that talk together becomes important. So here's an example of when Homer and Marge are talking to each other. We can see very clearly that they are talking to each other. If Lisa has to come into the shot and talk to Marge, you're most likely going to have Lisa enter on the side where Marge is so that they can talk to each other. If Lisa was going to enter and talk to Homer, then once again you're going to put her on the side where Homer is, so it becomes much clearer that they are then talking to each other. This is a basic rule of sitcom staging that is generally the sole purview of the storyboard artist, how to place characters. A lot of what we're doing is staging, blocking the characters out so they can deliver the writing effectively. If, however, you are going to have, if in the sequence, Lisa and Marge are going to talk, but then Homer and Lisa argue, you have to figure out what's the most important part of the sequence. Is it, and most likely it would be Homer and Lisa arguing, because that's something that's going to drive the story forward. So if Lisa has to talk with Marge, but argue with Homer, stage it so that she gets to talk close to Marge first, but argue with Marge sort of blocking them in the background and creating an odd composition. It might be much better to have Lisa and Marge talk over Homer, since that won't be blocking the composition, but you can then cut in and have the important part of the sequence, the storytelling pose, be clear and in its staging and effectiveness and readability. So again, there's exceptions to every rule, and part of the job of most of the job of the storyboard artist is to decide what's most important for the script, for moving the story forward, and then staging it in the most effective way possible to make sure that that storytelling gets effectively. And last of my three aspects is, can you use dynamic shots? Now, I know I told you about how flat and stage-like we want to set up for primetime sitcoms. However, you will often see that because animation can do anything, showrunners for these sitcoms like to every so often break away and do a dynamic shot as long as it's in service of the joke or the story being told. So I'm going to show you some examples of what dynamic shots are and what I mean by that. So in this part of the story, Gina here is in love with Dusty, and for this joke, she is telling the other cop, Ethel from Brickleberry, that he's mine, don't even look at him. That's the setup to the joke. The joke being that Ethel says, everywhere I look is at him. Using a setup like this, where the, if the joke is that this character is just too big to be missed, then making him take up so much of the frame is the visual enhancing the verbal. And showrunners love when we do that. It's a big part of our job, is to make sure that what we are doing visually is enhancing the joke. So looking and seeing the setup and joke here, we will do a dynamic shot that emphasizes the joke. This is different than the regular sitcom staging. Because it's animation, we get away with doing it maybe a couple times an episode. Other example, Dad, where they want to make sure that what the character is seeing is awe-inspiring and setting up the stage. So we'll have a shot like this. We'll also do a shot where the characters are blocked from exiting by a bunch of lawyers. So here I've done a canted framing, tilted to the side, with a nice strong angles to make sure that the point gets across, and using characters in this dynamic fashion so that we really get an emphasis of how important it is that what they're saying. Here's another angle of when character is about to slam on the accelerator and drive the police van away, and a nice dramatic angle will emphasize this during a chase scene. What's important to notice that while we can occasionally do dynamic shots like this, an important rule for primetime sitcoms is that even though we have this dynamic angle on the body, the head is the same 3/4 front, always the same 3/4 front that would be used even if the characters are a little bit off because of the drama of the angle. But having the 3/4 head, generally, it's very rare that we will call for in primetime animation for a character to have an up shot or down shot or a 7/8 head instead of 3/4. So once you put the head down, you can do dynamic angles and perspective on the bodies as long as the head remains absolutely clear. We know who this character is. It's the character exactly as we're used to seeing her. This becomes very important to primetime animation. And one last point that I would like to say before we move on to from stage joke telling is be prepared to do a lot of poses, a lot of drawing. This was from an American Dad episode where characters are doing some tricks on a surfboard. I think this section takes about a second or a second and a half. It's a lot of poses, there's a lot of drawings. You can see I don't have to do a perfect head every time, but making sure that the bodies are there is important because, once again, the remote studio, who's getting paid a lot less than we are, is not necessarily going to fill in all the perfect details. And it becomes risky whether or not it'll come back looking the way you wanted it to. So I just have a couple examples of how much drawing is necessary on primetime animation to make sure that actions come through exactly the way you want. And so yes, it could be possible that you could draw this pose and this pose with the ball falling and get back a decent enough hook shot. But it is risky, and sometimes you will be asked to specifically do a number of these poses. This is a dance that I think took all of 3 seconds that was eventually cut from the episode anyway, just for time. But you just want to make sure that if dancing, fighting, some sort of movement comes out, that you are able to draw enough to get that action across. I have seen people turn in a test where specifically a fight scene or a dance or some action was asked for to see how the artist handles doing those posing. And the storyboard artist doing the test will do simply one pose and write "they fight." And without knowing how you're going to handle getting something like that, it's an immediate no when looking at your portfolio, because the job is to create that blueprint that everyone else is going to follow from then on. So don't be afraid to draw. It takes a lot of poses to do some of this, and so it's very important to move on and make sure that you do all those poses. And it can be rough as long as it's in proportion And the point is getting across of the timing, the staging, and how you handle action.